Frank Thompson opened his eyes at exactly 6:15 a.m., just as he had done every day for the past 43 years. The 93-year-old World War II veteran didn't need an alarm clock anymore. His body knew when it was time to start the day. His bedroom was neat and organized, with his military photos hanging straight on the light blue walls. A picture of his late wife Sarah sat on the bedside table, her gentle smile still bringing warmth to his heart after all these years. He slowly got out of bed, his joints creaking like old floorboards. His movements were careful but determined as he went through his morning routine. First came the crisp white shirt, then the navy blue sweater Sarah had given him on their last Christmas together, and finally his comfortable brown shoes that his granddaughter had bought him last birthday. Frank never forgot to pin his World War II service pin to his sweater. It was small, but it meant the world to him. At exactly 6:45 a.m., Frank picked up his wooden cane, the one he had carved himself from oak 10 years ago. He checked his wallet, house keys, and the small notebook he always carried to write down interesting things he saw during the day. The morning air was cool and fresh as he stepped out of his small white house on Maple Street in Burlington, Vermont. The walk to Linda's diner took exactly 12 minutes if he maintained his steady pace. Frank knew every crack in the sidewalk, every flowering bush, and every neighbor's cat along the way. Mrs. Rodriguez, who lived 3 houses down, was usually watering her roses and would wave to him. Today was no different, and Frank tipped his hat to her as he passed by. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," called out Tommy, the newspaper boy, as he cycled past. Frank smiled and waved back, remembering how he used to deliver papers himself when he was Tommy's age, long before the war changed everything. The familiar red and white sign of Linda's Diner came into view at exactly 6:57 a.m. The morning sun made the chrome trim on the building shine like polished silver. Frank could already smell the coffee and bacon through the door as he approached. The little bell above the door rang cheerfully as he pushed it open, announcing his arrival to the staff who were all waiting for him. "Morning, Frank," called out Betty, the head waitress who had been serving him for the past 15 years. She was already walking to his special corner booth with a cup of black coffee in hand. The booth had a small brass plaque on the wall above it that read, "Frank and Sarah's Corner." The owner had put it there after Sarah passed away 5 years ago. "Morning, Betty," Frank replied with a warm smile, carefully sliding into his seat. The vinyl cushion had a slight dip in it from years of him sitting in the exact same spot. He didn't need to look at the menu anymore. Betty already knew his order by heart. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, no butter, and your coffee's already here," she said, placing the steaming cup in front of him. The familiar aroma of the coffee mixed with the sounds of the kitchen and the quiet chatter of early morning customers made Frank feel at home. From his booth, he could watch the town wake up. The bank across the street would open at 8, and Mr. Chen would unlock his grocery store at 7:30. The morning light streamed through the large windows, making patterns on the table that reminded Frank of the way sunlight used to dance on Sarah's hair when they sat here together. Frank pulled out his small notebook and pen, ready to write down his thoughts for the day. Today felt different somehow, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Maybe it was the unusual number of motorcycles he had noticed parked on Main Street during his walk. Or perhaps it was just the changing weather. Either way, Frank Thompson settled into his morning routine, unaware that his peaceful world was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. The peace of Linda's Diner shattered one Tuesday morning when the first motorcycle roared into the parking lot. Frank's coffee cup rattled against its saucer as 5 more bikes followed, their engines so loud that Tommy dropped his stack of newspapers outside. The clock on the wall showed 7:45 a.m. Frank had been enjoying his breakfast for nearly 30 minutes when they arrived. The bikers called themselves the Road Warriors, and they made sure everyone knew it. Their leather jackets displayed their gang name in bright red letters, with skull patches and chains hanging from their shoulders. Their leader, a tall man with a thick beard and dark sunglasses, went by the name Snake. The others called him Boss and followed his every move. Betty's hands shook slightly as she carried plates to their table. These weren't the usual friendly bikers who sometimes stopped by during summer road trips. These men carried an air of trouble with them, like storm clouds on a sunny day. They took over the biggest booth, spreading out their maps and speaking in loud voices that echoed through the diner. At first, they simply ignored Frank, just another old man having his breakfast. But then Snake noticed the World War II service pin on Frank's sweater. He nudged his friend, a shorter man with tattoos covering his arms, and whispered something that made them both laugh. Frank pretended not to notice, focusing instead on his eggs and toast. The next day, the bikers arrived earlier, just as Frank was walking through the door. One of them stuck out his boot slightly, not enough to trip Frank, but enough to make him stumble. They snickered behind their coffee cups as he steadied himself with his cane. Betty saw it happen and started to say something, but Frank shook his head slightly. He didn't want any trouble. As days turned into weeks, their behavior got worse. They would mimic Frank's careful way of walking, exaggerating his movements and making cruel jokes. When Frank would spread his napkin on his lap, they would do the same with dramatic flourishes, causing their friends to roar with laughter. They started calling him Grandpa Time and Old Timer in mocking voices. Linda, the diner's owner, tried to have a word with them about respecting her customers. Snake just smiled at her, showing his teeth like a wolf, and said they were paying customers too. He reminded her that their money was as good as anyone else's, maybe even better since there were 6 of them spending more than one old man having coffee. The other regular customers started avoiding the diner during morning hours. Even Mrs. Peterson, who had been coming for her morning coffee for 20 years, switched to the cafe across town. The only ones who stayed loyal were Frank and a few others who refused to be intimidated. Frank noticed how the harassment affected the staff too. Betty's usual cheerful smile became forced, and her hands trembled more when she served the bikers. Jim, the cook, kept looking out from the kitchen with worry in his eyes. Even Tommy stopped delivering papers to the diner when the bikes were parked outside. The worst part wasn't the direct harassment. It was the way they had changed the atmosphere of the place. The diner had always been like a second home to Frank, filled with friendly faces and warm conversations. Now it felt like a battleground, with tension hanging in the air like thick smoke. One morning, as Frank carefully counted out his tip for Betty, Snake walked by and knocked the coins off the table with a sweep of his hand. As Frank watched the quarters roll under nearby tables, he felt something he hadn't experienced since the war. A familiar mix of anger and determination. The kind of feeling that told him it was time to take action. But first, he needed to understand his enemy, just as he had been taught in military intelligence all those years ago. Part 3, The Breaking Point. The morning started like any other. There was something different in the air. The sky was darker than usual, heavy with rain clouds that seemed to mirror the mood inside Linda's diner. Frank had finished his breakfast and was preparing to leave, carefully counting out his usual tip for Betty, when all 6 bikers entered at once. Snake was in a particularly bad mood that day. His motorcycle had refused to start properly in the morning, and he needed someone to take his frustration out on. His eyes landed on Frank, who was slowly rising from his booth, leaning on his carefully carved oak cane. "Look alive, old timer," Snake called out, his voice carrying across the diner. "Some of us actually have places to be today." The other bikers chuckled, spreading out to block the path between Frank's booth and the door. Frank took his time, dignity evident in every movement. He'd faced worse in the war, he told himself. Betty watched nervously from behind the counter, her hand hovering near the phone. She'd already called the police twice about the bikers, but they were always gone before any officers arrived. As Frank started his careful walk toward the door, Snake stepped directly into his path. The old veteran stopped, looking up at the much taller man with calm eyes that had seen far worse than an angry biker. For a moment, their eyes met, and something flickered across Snake's face, perhaps uncertainty at the lack of fear in the old man's gaze. But then one of his gang members laughed, and Snake's face hardened again. With a deliberate motion, he knocked Frank's cane aside with his boot. The carved oak clattered across the floor, spinning under a nearby table. Frank wobbled but didn't fall. His right hand instinctively reached out to steady himself against a table, while his left hand, the one that had once thrown grenades with deadly accuracy, clenched into a fist at his side. The diner fell completely silent. "Oops," Snake said with fake concern. "Looks like you dropped something, Grandpa." The other bikers roared with laughter, but their leader's eyes never left Frank's face, waiting for signs of fear or anger. Betty rushed forward with a dishcloth clutched in her hands like a weapon. "That's enough," she shouted, her voice shaking but determined. "I'm calling the police right now." "No, Betty," Frank said quietly, his voice steady and clear. "No need for that." He straightened up to his full height, his military bearing evident despite his age. Without looking away from Snake, He spoke to the room at large. Would someone be kind enough to retrieve my cane? Jim, the cook, was already hurrying out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. He retrieved the cane and handed it back to Frank, glaring at the bikers the whole time. "Thank you, Jim," Frank said calmly. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled at Snake. Not a scared smile or an angry one, but the kind of smile that suggested he knew something the biker didn't. Snake took half a step back before he caught himself. Frank walked to the door with slow, deliberate steps. At the threshold, he turned back and looked at each of the bikers in turn. "You boys have a nice day now," he said, then walked out into the gathering storm. That evening, Frank sat in his study, surrounded by old photographs and medals from his service days. His cane rested against his desk, slightly scuffed from its encounter with the diner floor. On the desk lay his military intelligence manual from 1943, its pages yellowed but still readable. Next to it sat his small notebook, open to a fresh page. As rain drummed against the windows, Frank began to write. His hand was steady as he made notes, just as it had been when he planned operations in the Pacific. The humiliation of the morning had burned away, replaced by something else, a familiar feeling of purpose. These boys thought they were warriors, but they had never faced a real one. It was time to show them what strategy really meant. For the next 7 days, Frank changed his routine for the first time in decades. Instead of sitting in his usual booth, he chose different spots in the diner each day. The bikers noticed this change, but thought the old man was trying to avoid them. They were wrong. Frank was watching, learning, and taking notes in his small notebook. From his various positions, he observed their patterns. Snake always sat facing the door, an old habit that Frank recognized from his own military days. The smallest biker, who they called Wrench, had a habit of playing with a silver cross necklace while he talked. Frank noticed how his voice softened whenever he mentioned his mother. The tallest one, Bear, always ordered the same breakfast as Frank, 2 eggs over easy and wheat toast. He would carefully wipe his mouth after each bite, just like Frank did. These weren't the actions of a natural bully, Frank thought. They were learned behaviors. During his afternoon walks, Frank started taking new routes that passed by the local motorcycle repair shop where the group often gathered. He noticed how Snake treated his motorcycle, not with the rough handling you'd expect, but with gentle care, almost like a father with a child. The way he wiped the chrome reminded Frank of how soldiers used to clean their rifles. One day, Frank visited the local library and asked Miss Thompson, the librarian, to help him look up local motorcycle clubs on the computer. She was surprised but happy to help. Together they found articles about charity rides and toy drives organized by different biker groups. Frank made careful notes about these events. In the evenings, Frank spread his gathered intelligence across his desk like he used to do during the war. He had drawings of where each biker parked their motorcycle, notes about their breakfast orders, and observations about their conversations. He noticed how they always paid their bills in full and even left tips, despite their rough behavior. The most interesting discovery came when Frank overheard Snake talking on his phone outside the diner. "Yes, sir," Snake had said, his voice completely different from his usual tough tone. "I'll visit this Sunday, Dad. Yes, I'll wear the suit to church this time." This piece of information made Frank smile. Everyone had another side to them, even bullies. Frank also studied their weaknesses. The group wasn't as united as they appeared. When Snake wasn't looking, Wrench would sometimes help elderly customers with their bags. Bear would sneak extra tips onto tables when he thought no one was watching. These weren't hardened criminals. They were young men playing at being tough guys. One particular detail caught Frank's attention. Every Thursday, before the group arrived at the diner, they would stop at the Veterans Memorial in the town square. They never mentioned it, but Frank saw them through the diner's window, taking off their helmets for a moment of silence. This observation made him think about his brother James, who had served in a motorcycle battalion during the war. Late at night, Frank would sit in his study, looking at old photographs from his military days. One photo showed him with his intelligence team, planning operations in the Pacific. They had won battles not through strength, but through understanding their opponents. "Know your enemy better than they know themselves," his commanding officer used to say. Frank pulled out his brother's old military photos, especially the ones with the motorcycle battalion. He remembered how James used to talk about the brotherhood among military bikers. An idea began to form in his mind. not a plan of confrontation, but one of connection. As he organized his notes one final time, Frank smiled. The bikers thought they were dealing with a feeble old man, but they were about to meet a strategic mind that had helped win a war. Sometimes, he thought, the best way to defeat an enemy is to turn them into friends. Early Monday morning, before the bikers' usual arrival time, Frank walked into Linda's diner carrying an old leather photo album. Betty watched curiously as he set it on the biker's regular table instead of going to his usual booth. Inside, he carefully arranged 5 black and white photographs, each one showing proud young men with their military motorcycles from World War II. The rumble of motorcycles announced the road warriors' arrival at exactly 8:15 a.m. Snake entered first, his boots heavy on the diner's floor. He stopped short when he saw the photographs on their table, causing Bear to bump into him from behind. "What's this?" Snake picked up the first photograph, showing young soldiers posing with their Harley-Davidson Dually motorcycles in 1943. The image showed Frank's brother James, standing proud in his uniform beside his bike, the same model that Snake now rode in vintage form. Frank watched from his corner booth as the bikers gathered around the photos. Their usual loud voices had dropped to whispers. Wrench carefully picked up another photo showing motorcycle mechanics working on their bikes in the field. "My brother James," Frank said clearly from his booth, causing all 6 bikers to turn. He served with the 2nd Motorcycle Battalion in Europe. Those men and their bikes saved countless lives, carrying messages through enemy lines when radio communications were down. Snake looked back at the photo in his hands, then at Frank. The usual mockery was gone from his face, replaced by something else: respect, maybe even awe. "These are original photos?" he asked, his voice unusually quiet. Frank nodded and slowly walked over to their table. "That bike your friend Bear is looking at in that photo. It carried medical supplies through German artillery fire to reach trapped Allied soldiers. The rider earned a Silver Star for that mission." Bear's hands were trembling slightly as he held the photograph. His own father had been a military medic, though he never told his fellow bikers this. Frank pulled out another photo from his album. This one showed James teaching other soldiers how to maintain their motorcycles in the field. "My brother always said that a motorcycle wasn't just a machine. It was a brother in arms. You had to treat it with respect, understand its soul." "That's exactly what my grandfather used to say," Wrench said softly, touching his silver cross necklace. The other bikers looked at him in surprise. He never mentioned his grandfather before. Frank spent the next hour sharing stories about the motorcycle battalions. He told them about night missions where riders had to navigate without headlights, about mechanics who could fix engines under enemy fire, and about the brotherhood that formed between riders. The bikers pulled up chairs, their breakfast getting cold as they listened. Snake asked questions about maintenance techniques from the war era, many of which were still relevant to his vintage Harley. Bear shared stories about his father's medical service, and Wrench finally told them about his grandfather, who had been a motorcycle messenger in Korea. Betty watched in amazement from behind the counter as the scene unfolded. The same men who had been terrorizing Frank for weeks were now hanging on his every word, showing him the same respect they'd expect their own grandfathers to receive. As Frank finished his stories, he pulled out one final photograph. It showed a group of young soldiers and their bikes, and what caught everyone's attention was the flag they were holding. It had the same skull symbol that the road warriors now used on their jackets. The skull wasn't always a symbol of fear, Frank explained gently. For these men, it represented facing death to protect others. They called themselves road warriors too, but their war was against tyranny, not against their own neighbors. The diner had fallen completely silent. Even the usual morning customers had stopped eating to watch this unexpected scene unfold. Snake looked down at his jacket, then back at the old photograph, seeing his group symbol in a completely new light. The next morning, Snake arrived at the diner alone, something he had never done before. He carried an old shoebox under his arm, the kind people use to store memories. Frank was in his usual booth, and for the first time since the bikers had started coming to the diner, Snake asked politely if he could join him. "I called my father last night," Snake said, his voice lacking its usual hardness. He opened the shoebox carefully, as if handling precious treasure. "I told him about your brother's photographs, and he got real quiet. Then he told me to look in his old military trunk in our attic." Snake's hands trembled slightly as he pulled out a yellowed envelope. Inside was a photograph that made Frank's heart skip a beat. The image showed a group of young soldiers standing next to their motorcycles, and there, in the center of the group, stood Frank's brother James. Next to him was a young man who looked remarkably like Snake. "That's my grandfather, Robert Davidson," Snake said, pointing to the man next to James. "He served in the same motorcycle battalion as your brother. They weren't just in the same unit. According to my dad, they were best friends." Frank leaned closer to the photograph, memories flooding back. "Bobby D," he whispered. "James used to write home about him. They called them the dynamic duo because they could fix any bike under fire." His fingers traced the edge of the photograph gently. Betty, who had been pretending not to listen from nearby, couldn't help but come closer. She brought fresh coffee without being asked, her eyes wide as she looked at the photograph. "My grandfather passed away when I was 10, Snake continued, his tough guy image completely forgotten. "But I remember him teaching me about motorcycles. He always said that a true rider respects everyone on the road, that we're all part of the same family of travelers." Frank nodded, remembering similar words from his brother. "James used to say that too. He said the road doesn't care who you are, it treats everyone the same." Snake pulled out more items from the shoebox, his grandfather's military patches, old letters, and a worn leather wallet. Inside the wallet was a small, creased photograph of James and Robert sitting on their motorcycles, grinning at the camera. "Do you know what hurts the most?" Snake asked, his voice rough with emotion. "All these weeks, we've been disrespecting the memory of everything my grandfather stood for. You would have been ashamed of how we treated you." The diner had grown quiet, other customers sensing the importance of the moment. Through the window, they could see the other road warriors arriving, parking their bikes with unusual care and respect. "Your grandfather was a hero," Frank said softly. "He saved James's life once, when their unit was under heavy fire. James had been hit, and Bobby drove his motorcycle straight through enemy fire to reach him." Snake looked down at his hands, then back at Frank. "I never knew that story. Dad didn't talk much about Grandpa after he passed. I guess somewhere along the way, I forgot what being a real road warrior means." As the other bikers entered the diner, they found their leader sitting with Frank. Photographs spread across the table, both men wiping tears from their eyes. The tough facade that Snake had maintained for so long had crumbled in the face of this powerful connection to his own history. Betty brought more coffee cups for everyone, and soon the booth was surrounded by bikers, all listening intently as Frank shared stories about their leader's grandfather, stories of bravery, brotherhood, and the true meaning of being a warrior on the road. The change in the road warriors happened almost overnight, but it wasn't just for show. Every morning at 7 a.m., 2 motorcycles would pull up outside Frank's house. The riders would wait patiently, their engines quietly idling, until Frank emerged with his cane. They would then escort him to Linda's diner, riding slowly to match his preferred walking pace. Snake had assigned his men different days to be Frank's morning escorts, creating a careful schedule that everyone followed without complaint. On Mondays and Thursdays, it was Bear's turn. He would often arrive early to help Frank with his garden, his large hands surprisingly gentle with the delicate flowers that Sarah had planted years ago. Wrench took Tuesdays and Fridays, and he had fixed the squeaky front gate that had been bothering Frank for months. He also serviced Frank's old radio, making it work better than it had in years. The young biker's mechanical skills reminded Frank so much of his brother James that sometimes his eyes would get misty watching Wrench work. At the diner, things had changed completely. The biker's table was now right next to Frank's booth, and they would often join him for breakfast. They kept their voices down, minded their manners, and showed genuine interest in Frank's stories. Betty couldn't help but smile every time she saw them all together, remembering how different things had been just a few weeks ago. Snake, in particular, had transformed the most. He started bringing his own family photographs to share with Frank, eager to learn more about his grandfather's service days. The old veteran helped him identify places and people in the photos, filling in gaps in Snake's family history that he had never known existed. One morning, a group of rowdy teenagers came into the diner and started making fun of Frank's slow movements. Before Betty could say anything, all 6 road warriors stood up. Snake walked over to the teenagers' table, his presence commanding immediate attention. "That man," Snake said quietly but firmly, pointing to Frank, "helped save the world before you were born. Show some respect, or find somewhere else to eat." The teenagers quickly apologized and left, leaving their half-eaten breakfast behind. The Road Warriors' reputation in town began to change too. When they organized their annual motorcycle rally, they dedicated it to military veterans and invited Frank to be the guest of honor. He rode in Snake's sidecar, wearing his old service cap, as hundreds of bikes followed behind them through the streets of Burlington. The group started visiting the local VA hospital regularly, with Frank helping them organize motorcycle maintenance workshops for younger veterans. Many of the patients found it easier to talk about their experiences while working on bikes, just as Frank's brother James had always said they would. During these visits, Snake would often sit with older veterans, listening to their stories with the same respect he now showed Frank. The tough biker leader had discovered a new mission: preserving the memories and honoring the sacrifices of those who had served. Frank's corner booth at the diner became a gathering place for both young and old. Other bikers from different groups would stop by, drawn by the stories of how the Road Warriors had changed. They would find Frank surrounded by his new friends, sharing stories and wisdom over cups of coffee and plates of eggs. Betty added a new photo to the wall above Frank's booth, one showing Frank in his service uniform next to a recent picture of him with the Road Warriors. Under it, she hung a small sign that read, "Where past and present ride together." On warm evenings, the sound of motorcycles could often be heard on Frank's street, but now it brought smiles instead of worry to the neighbors' faces. The bikes would stop outside his house, and young riders would sit on his porch, listening to stories of brotherhood, honor, and the true meaning of being a warrior, lessons that Snake's grandfather and Frank's brother had lived by, now being passed down to a new generation. 1 year later, Linda's diner was more crowded than ever on a special Sunday morning. Colorful balloons decorated Frank's corner booth, and a large banner read "Happy 94th Birthday." The parking lot was filled with motorcycles, their chrome shining in the morning sun. Snake stood at the center of the diner, gently tapping his coffee cup with a spoon to get everyone's attention. His leather jacket was clean and polished, with a new patch that showed a motorcycle alongside military service medals. The other Road Warriors wore similar patches, symbols of their new mission. A year ago, Snake began, his voice carrying through the quiet diner. We thought being tough meant pushing others around. Then we met a man who showed us what real strength looks like. He turned to Frank, who sat in his usual booth, surrounded by both old and new friends. Frank taught us that true warriors don't create fear, they create respect. The walls of the diner had changed over the past year. Alongside the old photographs of Frank and Sarah, new ones showed the Road Warriors at various community events. There were pictures of them escorting veterans in parades, helping at homeless shelters, and teaching young people about motorcycle safety and respect. Betty brought out a special birthday cake, decorated with both military and motorcycle themes. As she set it down, she remembered how different things had been just 1 year ago. Now, her hands were steady and her smile was genuine as she served the mixed crowd of bikers, veterans, and regular customers who had all become part of this unusual family. The biggest change was visible in the young people who now frequented the diner. Local teenagers who once might have caused trouble now sat respectfully with Frank and the bikers, learning about history and honor. The Road Warriors had started a mentorship program, pairing troubled youth with veteran riders who could guide them toward a better path. Wrench had opened a small motorcycle repair shop next door to the diner, where he offered free maintenance lessons to veterans. The shop's walls featured photographs of military motorcycles from different eras, and Frank would often sit there, sharing stories with customers about his brother James and the brave motorcycle battalions of World War II. Bear, who had discovered a passion for photography, had created a special album documenting their journey. The first photo showed the day they had mocked Frank's cane. The latest showed them all together at the VA hospital, where they now volunteered regularly. The change in their faces was remarkable, from hard and angry to proud and purposeful. The Road Warriors had established a scholarship fund in honor of Frank's brother James and Snake's grandfather Robert. Each year, they would help a veteran's child attend mechanical engineering school. The first recipient was Tommy, the newspaper boy, whose father had served in Afghanistan. Linda, the diner's owner, had turned the establishment into an unofficial museum of veteran biker history. People would come from neighboring towns just to see the photograph collection and hear the stories. She had even started a tradition of free coffee for any veteran who visited, a practice the Road Warriors helped support through their fundraising rides. As Frank blew out his birthday candles, surrounded by leather-clad bikers and smiling faces, he thought about how his military training had helped him win this most unexpected battle, not through force or confrontation, but through understanding and connection. His strategic mind had turned enemies into allies, and allies into family. Snake presented Frank with a special gift, a custom-made leather jacket with his brother James's military unit insignia. On the back was written, "Original Road Warrior, Class of 1943. As Frank put it on, his eyes tearing up slightly, the diner erupted in applause and cheers. The legacy of Frank's quiet victory continued to grow. Other motorcycle clubs from around the state began adopting similar veteran support programs. The story of how one elderly veteran had transformed a group of troubled bikers through wisdom rather than force became a legend in Burlington, passed down to inspire future generations about the true meaning of strength and respect.